We open episode 19 on Cinder walking the back alleys of Mistral during a heavy downpour. Few people litter the streets, running through the water to get here or there, and fewer pay attention to Cinder as she walks. Eventually she makes her way through an alley and comes out its mouth, where she gets a somewhat clear visual on the chop shop. Her eyes narrow as she looks to the entrance, where Mistralian police and Menagerie militia are positioned around the perimeter. They are stopping any and all civilians who get close and are removing their hoods and hats to get clear identification. Cinder frowns and looks to the roof, where there's a number of figures patrolling. Cinder growls in frustration just as Team Auburn approaches the installation to relieve the gate guards. We jump over to their perspective, where Arslan gets a sixth sense about someone watching them, and looks over to the alley to see a hooded figure vanish. Eyes hardening, Arslan cranes her neck to her team and tells them, "Hold down the fort, I'm gonna get something to eat," before walking off. Bolin raises his hand in confusion after her, saying, "But we just ate." We follow Arslan into the alley, and we get matching shots of her and this hooded figure maneuvering the cramped passages, their speed gradually getting faster and faster till they're both practically sprinting, the rain making for muddy terrain as they enter Mistral's swampy underbelly. At the end of the chase, Arslan comes to a corner and rounds it, sliding in the mud as we in the audience hear a gust of wind. She finds herself facing a concrete wall with no one in sight. She stands there, baffled for a moment, looking for any possible avenue of escape, only to give up and turn back in frustration. As she goes, the camera pans up to show Cinder on a rooftop, partially obscured by a tree growing from the foundation. We cut to Cinder entering what seems to be an apartment or a house, the kitchen of which has untended bloodstains, drag marks, and broken furniture, implying she murdered the people that lived here. Cinder, still dripping, goes to the fridge and opens it, finding nothing inside. Going to the pantry, again, she finds nothing. In frustration, she hisses, "Why are you people so damn poor?" While checking the lower cabinets, Cinder manages to find a mostly empty bag of rice, one that has been clearly gnawed on and stolen from by different animals. With a sigh, she takes it out and we cut to her having finished cooking and eating it, her stomach still growling as she lays down to sleep on the couch. Gripping her stomach, Cinder curls in on herself and closes her eyes. We hear Cinder, in her younger voice, say, "When are we going to eat? I'm starving. I haven't eaten for days." We cut to find Tyrion pulling the younger girl through the dark corridors of Evernight Castle by her arm, his face scrunching in anger. "You are about to meet our goddess. Forget your worldly concerns for a moment." Cinder struggles against him, hissing, "I don't want to meet your stupid goddess. I just want—" There's a slap as Tyrion backhands Cinder. She stands there, shocked, as he sharply says, "What you want is irrelevant." Cinder stays quiet, holding her cheek as she is pulled into the massive throne room. Standing beside the throne is Watts, slightly younger than we've seen him previously. Like a tree, we can gauge his age by the length of his mustache, also by the grain of his hair, but you know that's not quite as iconic. He takes only a glance at Cinder. "I wasn't aware we were in the business of recruiting rodents." Cinder glares at him and bares her teeth, and he only replies with a dry, "Charming." Tyrion shoves her in front of the throne and matches Watts' look. "Ah, but you see, rats are cunning, and when pushed to their limits, they can do incredible things," he says, forcing Cinder to kneel. Watts gives a flat look in reply and rolls his eyes. And he's laughing again. A voice cuts through the laughter. "Enough of your bickering." Immediately, Tyrion shuts up and becomes completely obedient, his back stick straight and his head bowed in reverence towards the throne. Calmly, Salem asks, "Who are you?" Cinder glares up at Salem, but remains silent, defiant. After the pause becomes too long, Tyrion tries to step in and say, "This is..." only for Salem to cut him off. "Tyrion? Her, not you." Cinder continues to glare silently up at Salem, and Salem stands to approach the girl. "You have a fire in your eyes. A pure, unbridled vitriol. Hatred. But for what, I wonder?" Salem stops a few feet away from Cinder, and then begins to circle her as she talks, appraisingly so. "If I were to guess, I would suspect life itself." As Salem goes, she seems to get lost in her own words. "It's a common enough tale. Life saddles us all with injustice, cruelty, the knowledge that those that have done us wrong have gone unpunished. Cinder actually looks up a bit at that, but drops her head aside when her eyes briefly meet Salem's. However, I rarely see it in someone so young. Salem pauses in front of Cinder and turns to her fully. She draws closer and caresses Cinder's face with an outstretched hand. Cinder winces at the contact. My dear, who has hurt you? Cinder's eyes shoot open and she lunges up from her crouch, a glass knife forming in her hands as she drives it up into Salem's ribcage. There is a beat before Salem's body slumps over Cinder's. Curiously, neither Watts nor Tyrion react, watching expectantly as Cinder lets out a dry, enraged cry and begins to mercilessly stab Salem again and again and again. After dozens of stabs, Cinder slows to a stop, the blade still lodged in Salem's gut. Her breathing is heavy, eyes glassy, but calmed. A second later, the camera closes in tighter and her eyes shrink in shock and terror. We pan down to her wrist, which is now locked in a death grip by Salem. Salem, her body and head still resting on Cinder's shoulder, slowly tears the blade from her gut, spilling rivulets of black ooze as she does. Once the blade is out, the wound heals almost immediately, as if it were never there. Salem's voice carries right next to Cinder's ear, soft and earnest. Do you feel better? Does that make you feel better? To Cinder's surprise, Salem runs the knife back into her own heart once, twice, 3 times before continuing. Does this soften the hurt? Now Salem raises her head and pulls away from Cinder, keeping her wrist in that deathlock. Cinder is terrified and tries to pull away, but Salem cedes no ground, instead saying, We're looking for people willing to cut ties to the past. Burn the old world and forge a new one. Salem reaches forward and brushes the hair out of Cinder's face. What do you desire? Control? Power? Salem squeezes Cinder's wrist, forcing her to drop the knife. It shatters as she continues. I can give you power, but power without purpose means nothing. She leans in close, wrapping her arms around Cinder's terrified shoulders, giving the girl an embrace that's natural to Salem, but stills Cinder. Resting her head on Cinder's shoulders, she says softly, Find your purpose. Here. A special thanks goes out to all of my wonderful patrons for supporting the channel. If you like this content and want more of it, please consider supporting it. Also consider picking up my new action-adventure novel, The Artificer, which is now available for purchase on Amazon in digital and in print. With that all said, back to your regularly scheduled fixing. The words echo as Cinder awakens on the couch, the rain still pounding outside. Her stomach growling, she grips it and rolls off the couch. We cut over to the spider's new hideout where Little Miss is enjoying some tea with her constituents, and 2 places that have been set and used but are currently empty. There is a commotion at the door as Wilbur is forcibly pushed through it by a pissed-off Cinder. He tries to push her back, but she casually stabs him in the leg and pushes him aside, strutting into the room past him. Wordlessly, Cinder approaches the table and falls into one of the seats across from Little Miss, who is staring at Cinder with thinly veiled disdain. Cinder starts the conversation by saying, My information, where is it? Little Miss calmly sets down her tea. I do believe you'll be paying for that door. Cinder scoffs. Take it out of my transportation cost. I just want the info. I'll leave the city on my own. Little Miss rests on her elbows. It's only been a couple of days. Presumptuous that I'd have it by now. Now shoo, I'm entertaining family. Cinder snarls. You don't know who you're dealing with. Little Miss pulls out her fan and replies, Oh, I know who I'm talking to. Miss Ash Autumn. See, you had me doing some digging into those huntresses in training, and it led me all the way back to Beacon. As she says this, a shadow appears in the doorway behind her, casually walking to the table but slowing. Mom? Who's sitting in Melanie's chair? Little Miss turns around and says, Oh, darlings, I'm sorry. Why don't you girls come sit down? Her words become pointed to Cinder. My guest was just leaving. Cinder glares at Little Miss and then up at Malachite, the amalgam personalities of Melanie and Milcha. Cinder's glare becomes confused, obviously searching for the second person implied by Little Miss's words. Little Miss continues, Would you kindly get out of my daughter's seat? Cinder narrows her eyes. There's plenty of room. Little Miss talks over her. You see, my daughters were there at the fall of Beacon. Cinder jolts in place, eyes beginning to harden. They suffered quite a bit because of you and your friend Torchwick. Malachite blinks in confusion and looks to Little Miss, saying, Mom? Little Miss ignores her and continues, I was willing to overlook that for the sake of business, but what you did to my girls. Little Miss cranes her neck up to her daughters. Well, Melanie, Milcha? What do you think? Malachite's eyes have gone feral and she lunges over the table at Cinder. Little Miss calmly picks up her tea and sips at it as Cinder rolls backwards to dodge the attack from Malachite. What follows is a replacement of the Cinder Neo fight from Volume 6 with a gradually escalating battle between Cinder and Malachite. Malachite, thanks to first mover advantage, has the early upper hand on Cinder, among a number of other factors such as recovering from being stabbed, drowned, concussed, malnourished, and being nibbled on by her evil-possessed grim arm of evil. Malachite has also stepped up her game, seemingly far more competent at balancing the two sets of weapons, which she now uses the full sets of with reckless abandon. The fight breaks out of the hideout into the streets where the two lock blades in the heavy rain. Very cinematic. We get a brief cutaway to Arslan in the market, asking questions to a vendor when she hears the commotion. She moves to investigate and hesitates, pulling at her scroll, but ultimately decides not to use it, leaving to check on what's happening without calling for backup. Back with the fight, Cinder is so steamed the rain is literally evaporating off her body thanks to Magic Maiden shenanigans. She also begins to turn the tide, and more Malachite is forced to take a defensive stance. Eventually, Malachite is forced to the ground, thoroughly beaten, and Cinder is about to impale her on a spear when a kunai shatters the weapon. Cinder turns to look at the approaching Arslan, who stops about 20 feet away. Cinder snarls at Arslan, You brat! Who do you think you are? Arslan's face twists into a scowl. My name is Arslan Altan. You should remember. Cinder shakes her head in disinterest, scoffing. I don't care. And with a flick, Cinder sends a glass knife at Arslan. Arslan easily dodges out of the way, and we begin a second mini-conflict between Arslan and Cinder. The fight is brief, and though Arslan does seem to have improved, she is no match as her blade string is cut, leaving her unarmed as Cinder waves a burning hand through her torso. Arslan doesn't even get out a scream as her body disintegrates in front of Cinder. The wind carries away her ashes as Cinder stares past where Arslan was, to where Little Miss is now cradling the bleary-eyed and injured Malachite. Little Miss looks to Cinder with fear. All right, you've made your point. Stop, please. They left for Argus. Best bet is that they're on their way to Atlas. Cinder looks at them, unimpressed, and turns to leave. As she steps away, Malachite struggles to her feet and says through gritted teeth, We're going with you. Cinder stops and looks back at her, sneering. For what purpose? Malachite coughs out a bit of blood. He needs to die. Roman needs to die. Cinder turns to face Malachite and appraises her. Cinder says, That look in your eye, with a bitter smile. We cut to an Atlesian boat off the coast of the Boot, where it appears there's a pair of engineers out to examine the hard light seawall. It's been mentioned in passing before and has been in the background of every shot looking out at the ocean. From the conversation on board, the unusual power drain mentioned last episode has seemed to spike, leading to some concerns among the engineering corps. To inspect the issue, one of the engineers suits up and drops into the water to inspect one of the most active pylons. He sinks a decent distance and begins to work on a fuse box, only for the panel to come loose and drop into the depths. Groaning, the man descends deeper, and just as he reaches for the panel, a loud shocking sound startles him. He leaps back and stares at the wall, where a series of other shocking sounds can be heard. He's confused at first, until he looks closer, and his eyes widen in terror. Just beyond the wall, we see a pair of red eyes. Then another. Then another. The camera cuts to a side view divided by the energy wall. On one side is the lone engineer, floating isolated in the depths of the water, and on the other is a veritable wall of grim, spread thick against the sea floor. As the man radios up to his partner, we cut back to the boot's lockup, where we see a numbered lockbox stored among many. We zoom in closer and closer before we're inside, where the relic of knowledge pulses menacingly. Cut to black. End of episode.